All right, diving into Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. It's a classic for a reason, right? I mean, you sent in some awesome excerpts, and it's clear this book still resonates after what, almost a century. Let's break down those core principles, see how they work.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how Carnegie starts off, with these like almost shocking examples. You highlighted how even like hardened criminals will justify what they do. He uses guys like Two Gun Crowley. It's like to show that deflecting blame, that's not just a gangster thing.
Yeah, yeah. It's almost like he's saying, hey, if Al Capone can rationalize his crimes, right, imagine how ingrained that self-justification is in all of us.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think that's why understanding, not criticizing, is so crucial if you actually want to influence
Yeah.
someone. So that first principle, don't criticize, condemn, or complain, that's like the bedrock.
It's funny because even someone like Abraham Lincoln, right,
Yeah.
known for being so diplomatic, even he struggled with this. You pointed out that story about his letter to General Meade after that Civil War battle.
Oh, yeah. It's a powerful example. I mean, Lincoln's incredibly skilled with people, but even he felt that urge to just lash out. And the fact that he didn't send that letter, I think, shows how much he'd grown in understanding that criticism just, it doesn't work.
It's a good reminder, huh? Even the best of us got to work at this. It makes me think of that father forgets anecdote, which you also pulled out. Just so relatable, that feeling of always needing to correct someone, even if it comes from a good place.
Yeah, and Carnegie's smart about it. He uses all these different examples.
Hmm.
Gangsters, presidents, families, it really hits home that criticism just erodes relationships.
Mm.
He's not saying like blindly accept bad behavior, but understanding is the starting point if you want to actually have some positive influence.
Okay, so less criticizing, more understanding. Got it. But then how do we actually motivate people? Carnegie's next big idea is all about, well, that human need to feel important.
Right, and this ties in with so much psychology. Maslow's hierarchy, Freud, Dewey, this desire, it drives us way more than we think.
I love those fun examples you pick, like Uncle Andrew and his empty envelopes, right? Just that little trick, and people felt special, eager to send him birthday cards.
Exactly, and it's not just birthday cards. Carnegie shows how it works in more serious situations too. That story of how he negotiated that ballroom rental, that's a good one.
Oh, yeah. By focusing totally on what the hotel manager needed, he totally flipped the situation around. It shows how powerful it can be to put someone else's importance first. It reminds me of the contrast he makes with that poorly written advertising letter.
Oh, right, right. That letter only cared about what the company wanted, ignored the reader completely. Total flop. You also pointed out Barbara Anderson's success with her job application, though.
Yeah, by explaining how her skills could help that bank reach its goals, she nailed it. Almost like a secret formula. Understand, then appeal to that desire for importance.
And it's not about manipulation. It's about genuinely connecting. When we make someone feel valued, it helps everyone.
This kind of leads us to another key thing you mentioned, that power of being genuinely interested in others. That story, the one about the little boy in the hospital on Thanksgiving, that's so powerful. That nurse, her kindness, it went above and beyond.
It really highlights that human connection that Carnegie keeps emphasizing.
Mm.
And then there's that stat he brings up about I being the most used word in phone calls. Kind of a stark reminder of how self-centered we can be.
So how do we change that? It's got to be more than just politely listening, right?
Right. It's about actually engaging with their world.
Yeah.
You mentioned Theodore Roosevelt going out of his way for his valet's wife just to show her a bird.
Yeah, a tiny gesture, but a huge impact. And it works in professional settings too, right? You highlighted how Carnegie himself used that to get those famous authors for his writing course.
Yeah, just by being sincerely interested in their work, he stood out. And then there's Mrs. Rosedale. She chose her bank because one employee asked about her sick mother.
Wow, one thoughtful question making that much of a difference. I mean, in the world of banking, that's huge. It proves that individual interest, really seeing the other person, that's what makes us memorable, builds those connections.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another core principle you pulled out, the art of listening. It's kind of funny how Carnegie, this master communicator, uses a story where he barely talks. And that's why he succeeds.
Oh, that dinner party story, right, where he just kept asking the botanist questions. He owned the conversation by being a master listener.
It's ironic, but it makes his point perfectly. And you also included that quote from Charles W. Eliot about how that exclusive attention, that's the most flattering thing in business.
And Henry James's description of Eliot actually sitting up straight, hands together, hearing with his eyes, it just paints such a picture.
It shows that listening isn't passive. It's active. It's engaged. You're showing the speaker that they really matter. And you also shared that example of Mr. Detmer calming down that furious customer just by listening.
Mr. Detmer didn't argue back. He just gave the guy space to vent. And that turned into a decades-long business relationship.
Yeah, it really proves how listening can de-escalate things, build trust, even in those heated moments. Sometimes the most influential thing to do is just be quiet, let the other person talk.
It's kind of counterintuitive though, right? Like the key to influencing people is to listen more than you talk. But Carnegie doesn't just say, listen up. He gives you a way to get better at it.
Yeah, he's big on that whole full attention thing. Put the phone away, the laptop, whatever's distracting you, and actually engage.
Hmm.
Eye contact, body language, that all shows you're present.
Makes me think of that quote about Charles W. Eliot, hearing with his eyes. It wasn't just about being quiet. It was like active, almost physical, how he took in what people were saying.
Exactly. And Carnegie's big on not interrupting too, even when you disagree. I gotta say, that one's tough for me. I get excited about ideas, want to jump in, but holding back, letting the other person finish, that's huge.
Creates a space of respect, doesn't it? Tells them their opinion matters enough to actually hear it all. And then instead of like firing back a rebuttal, Carnegie says, ask questions to clarify.
Yeah, it's subtle, but it changes things. Asking, can you tell me more about that? Or what made you think that way? Shows you're really trying to get their perspective.
It's the difference between just hearing words and like really getting the meaning. Makes me think about Mr. Detmer and that angry customer. Asking questions turn that whole thing around.
Total classic example, turning conflict into connection. But let's be real. Sometimes we do got to convince someone of something, right? Change their mind, get them to do something. Does Carnegie deal with that at all?
Oh, absolutely. He's got a whole section on persuasion. And the funny thing is, he starts off by saying trying to win an argument, it usually backfires.
I love that line. You can't win an argument. You can't, because if you lose it, you lose it. And if you win it, you lose it. So if arguing's out, what's the move?
He's got this great analogy. If you want to gather honey, don't kick over the beehive. Instead of like attacking their ideas head on, you got to be smarter, gentler.
Makes sense. And it gives some really good tactics. One is start by agreeing on stuff. Find common ground before you get into the disagreements.
Right. So it feels like you're working together, not fighting. Instead of you're wrong, it's I see your point and I agree with you on this and that, but I have a different view on this one thing.
Subtle, but important. You're acknowledging them while still making your point. And even then, Carnegie says, don't flat out tell someone they're wrong, even if you think they are.
Gotta remember, most people don't like changing their minds, especially if they feel attacked. So instead of, you're wrong, maybe it's more like, I see it a bit differently, or, that's interesting, have you thought about this?
Right. Respect their opinion, but kind of nudge them towards yours.
Yeah.
You highlighted how even Ben Franklin, super smart guy, he realized arguing was pointless.
He was, what was it, an inveterate arguer? Until he figured out that being more modest, less confrontational, made conversations better, and people were more open to his ideas.
It's a good reminder. A little change in how you communicate can make a huge difference. And Carnegie's big on owning up to your own mistakes, too.
There's that great anecdote about the architect. He messed up a little thing on the blueprints, admitted it right away to the client.
Happened.
Totally disarmed the guy. Client said it was no big deal. Just by owning up to it, the architect avoided a whole conflict, saved the relationship.
Humility over arrogance.
Right.
It builds trust, makes you more likable, so people actually listen. Okay, so we got no arguing, find common ground, don't say they're wrong, admit your mistakes. Lots to remember. But what if you do need to be assertive, like actually tell someone what to do?
Carnegie gets that. He says sometimes you got to give direct orders, but even then, he says, do it in a way that respects the other person.
Makes sense. One thing he suggests is phrase orders like they're suggestions. So instead of do this, it's what do you think about trying this? Or think this approach might work.
Gives them some control, right? Like they're part of the decision. Way better than just barking commands. And he also says, focus on what you want them to do, not what you don't want.
So not, don't leave your clothes on the floor, but it'd be great if you could hang them up when you're done.
Yeah, way more positive, encouraging. You highlighted that story about John D. Rockefeller Jr. He wanted to stop photographers from snapping pics of his kids.
Right. Instead of threats, he appealed to them as parents. Said, you know how it is, boys. You've got children yourselves, some of you. And you know it's not good for youngsters to get too much publicity.
Smart move. Using shared experience, values, got what he wanted without being a jerk.
Shows how you can get things done by appealing to people's better nature. even when you're the one in charge.
Makes me think of that story about the dad trying to reconnect with his teenage son. Instead of making excuses, he just admitted his mistakes, asked for forgiveness. The son, total disarmed by that, forgave him. Shows how taking responsibility can lead to healing.
Powerful stuff. Okay, so we've got avoiding arguments, finding common ground, making people feel important, being interested, listening, admitting mistakes, phrasing things right, being positive, appealing to good motives. And I feel like we're just scratching the surface.
It's crazy how much is in this one book, and it all still applies today, just as much as back then.
Totally. And even though we've talked about them one by one, they all fit together. Right? It's all about interacting with empathy, respect, wanting to connect.
It's about understanding where other people are coming from, their reasons, knowing everyone's got a story.
It's about relationships built on trust, respect, not trying to trick or control anyone. Real influence isn't about forcing people, it's inspiring them to want to follow you.
How to win friends and influence people is timeless because it gets at those core human needs. To be understood, to matter, to belong.
And when you tap into that in other people, you open up so much. Connection, working together, making things better. Speaking of making things better, you pulled out a really interesting section on enthusiasm, right?
Yeah, it's amazing how just changing your attitude a bit can have such a big effect. You mentioned that salesman, he was struggling, then his sales took off once he got excited about what he was selling.
It's contagious. That energy, people are drawn to it. It makes even boring stuff seem interesting.
It's about bringing that real excitement to everything, selling a product, pitching an idea, even just chatting with someone. Makes me think of Carnegie's suggestion to, dramatize your ideas, make them stick.
You had that great example of the salesman who threw pennies on the floor, right? To show how much those outdated cash registers were costing them.
Instead of just boring numbers, he made it visual, impactful.
Storytelling, anecdotes, visuals, it all helps get your message across. And that ties in with Carnegie's point about emotions, not just logic.
Oh, it reminds me of that other salesman, the one with the cold cream. He didn't do a regular pitch. He dumped 32 jars on the buyer's desk.
Wow. Okay, that's dramatic. What was the point?
Each jar was a competitor with all the market research tags and everything. He brought his research to life.
That's incredible. Takes it out of the abstract, makes it real, something you can connect with. And speaking of connecting, what was that one about the woman trying to stop those kids from running across her lawn?
Oh, classic. Yelling didn't work, reasoning didn't work, so she got creative.
She made the worst offender her detective to keep the others off her property.
And he went all in, even built a bonfire to scare off rule breakers. Hilarious example of how giving responsibility can motivate.
Appealing to that desire to feel important. It works. Wow, we've covered a lot. Understanding, making people feel important, being interested, listening, avoiding arguments, finding common ground, admitting mistakes, phrasing things right, being positive, appealing to good motives, giving people responsibility, and that's not even everything.
It's wild how much wisdom is in this book, and it all still applies today.
For sure. And while we've talked about them one by one, they all fit together, right?
Yeah.
It's all about interacting with empathy, respect, really wanting to connect.
It's about understanding where other people are coming from, their reasons, knowing everyone's got a story.
It's about building relationships based on trust and mutual respect, not manipulation or control. It's understanding that true influence doesn't come from forcing our will on others, but from inspiring them to want to follow our lead.
How to win friends and influence people is timeless because it speaks to these fundamental human needs. To be understood, to feel important, to belong.
And when we tap into these needs in others, we unlock possibilities for connection, collaboration, and positive change.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want you to think about this. Which of these principles really spoke to you? And what's one small thing you can do today to actually use it in your life? We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? All these principles from Carnegie's book. But I feel like there's this thread that runs through everything, this whole idea of really seeing things from the other person's side.
Right, that empathy he keeps talking about, being able to put yourself in their shoes, that's got to be the foundation, for avoiding conflicts, connecting with people, and influencing them in a good way.
You pointed out that story about Edward E. Harriman, right? He wanted a job in this town controlled by, this kind of infamous businessman, R.J. Funkhauser. Most people wouldn't even bother, but Harriman, he did something different.
Yeah, he did his homework. Found out Funkhauser had this amazing rags to riches story, and that's what he focused on. Instead of a generic application, he wrote a letter, genuinely admiring the guy's entrepreneurial spirit.
And boom, got the interview. And then instead of going on about himself, he kept talking about what Funkhauser was interested in, his vision for the future, that kind of stuff. Got the job right there on the spot.
See. Textbook example of Carnegie's principle.
Hmm.
Talk in terms of their interests. Show real curiosity. Make them feel like they're the only one who matters.
It's about like putting your own agenda aside, even just for a bit, and focusing on what's important to them. You have another good example, that salesman trying to sell bread to this hotel manager. He'd been striking out for years, then he figured something out about the manager.
Right? Found out the guy was a former baker, totally passionate about bread making. So the salesman, he changed his whole approach, started talking shop with the manager, asking about his baking days, really listening to his stories.
And what do you know? The next day, huge order comes in, tapping into that shared passion, that personal connection. That's how we finally got through.
The power of common ground, right? Building that rapport before you try to sell them on anything. It's like you're on the same side, not forcing something on them.
And then there's Carnegie's whole thing about appealing to people's better nature. He says most folks want to do the right thing, so talk to that. Their sense of fairness, compassion, all that.
Right. You highlighted how John D. Rockefeller Jr. dealt with that labor strike. Instead of this big power struggle, he spent weeks meeting with workers, listening to them, showing he understood where they were coming from.
And when he finally spoke to them, he acknowledged their right to strike, but also explained the company's side, the potential consequences. It wasn't about picking sides, it was about appealing to their sense of what's fair.
And it worked. The strikers were so moved by that, they agreed to go back to work. Appealing to people's better angels, it can be way more effective than force or trickery.
Reminds me of that story about the kid building a fire in the park. The ranger, he could have been authoritarian, but he took a different route.
Talk to the kid about the dangers, how it could hurt the park, other people. Appealed to his reason, his sense of responsibility, and it clicked. The kid got it, promised to be more careful.
It's about explaining the why, not just giving orders, treating people with respect, even when they've messed up. And then one last thing from Carnegie, that idea of giving people a good reputation to live up to.
He says people often rise to meet our expectations, especially when those expectations are good. You shared that story about the teacher and that shy student who wasn't doing so well.
Yeah, instead of focusing on what he couldn't do, she saw what he could be, told him she believed in him, even invited him to her advanced class.
And he took off. That belief in him, it unlocked something. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Our words can shape how people see themselves.
It's a reminder that we can inspire people to do amazing things when we show that confidence in them. So as we wrap up this deep dive into how to win friends and influence people, it's clear this book is way more than just a bunch of tricks.
It's a whole way of looking at human nature, connecting with people on a real level, building relationships that work for everyone.
A timeless guide to dealing with people, full of wisdom that's just as good now as it was all those years ago.
We hope you'll go back to those excerpts you sent in, think about which principles really resonated with you, and find ways to actually use them in your own life.
See what happens when you approach your relationships with genuine interest, with empathy, really wanting to understand. You might be surprised at the good that comes out of it.
Like Dale Carnegie said, you can make more friends in 2 months by becoming interested in other people than you can in 2 years by trying to get other people interested in you. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.